I am Lola Mitchell, 32 years old, a technical sergeant in the United States Air Force. I have dedicated my entire youth to maintaining C-17 Globemasters, ensuring the safety of thousands of soldiers. But to my mother, this uniform is just the attire of a failure. Exactly at 6:47 p.m. on Sunday, 5 days before Thanksgiving, she called to forbid me from coming home. She said coldly, "Vivian is bringing her billionaire boyfriend home to meet us. Your presence, your coarse, poor appearance will ruin your sister's chance for a better life. Know your place and stay away." She had no idea that while she was insulting my $58,000 salary, I was holding the power over the $15.2 million estate she so desperately craves. They think I'm the black sheep that needs to be hidden. They don't realize I am the trustee holding the keys to the family treasure. And this Thanksgiving, I won't be bringing a turkey, I'll be bringing a verdict. If you have ever been looked down upon by your family for your choices, please subscribe now and let me know what time and which state you are listening from. This is the journey of how I taught them a lesson in discipline and honor. The clock on my wall ticked with a rhythmic precision that usually brought me comfort, its hands resting exactly at 6:47 in the evening on Sunday, November 24th. My name is Lola Mitchell, and at 32 years old, I serve as a technical sergeant in the United States Air Force. I have spent my entire adult life maintaining C-17 Globemasters, those massive steel birds that carry the weight of our nation's promises across the globe. Outside my modest, drafty rental near Hanscom Air Force Base, the Boston winter wind howled against the window pane, rattling the glass like a restless spirit. I sat at my small kitchen table, my back instinctively straight, my focus entirely locked on the performance reports for the airmen under my command. I found a quiet sense of pride in seeing their progress, knowing they had mastered the complex protocols that keep our pilots safe. My world was one of hydraulic fluid, scorched metal, and the heavy, honest scent of jet fuel. A world where things worked according to logic, discipline, and hard-earned skill. The peace of the evening was abruptly shattered by the sharp, insistent vibration of my phone on the wooden table. The caller ID simply read, "Mom." I felt a small spark of warmth in my chest, a rare moment of civilian hope, and I answered with a genuine lift in my voice. I was just about to ask her about the Thanksgiving menu, wondering if she wanted me to bring the usual pies, or if we were trying something new this year. But before I could even finish my greeting, the voice on the other end, my mother, Patricia, cut through my words with the clinical coldness of a surgical blade. There was no inquiry about my health and certainly no interest in my work at the base. "Lola, I need to talk to you about this Thursday," she began, her tone devoid of any maternal softness. "Vivian is bringing Derek Hartwell home for the holiday, the chief executive officer of a major capital firm." She paused for a calculated second and then lowered her voice to a register of forced, hollow sympathy. "I think it is best if you do not attend this year, Lola." I sat there, the pen in my hand frozen, my knuckles turning white as my grip tightened. I asked her why, my voice sounding smaller than I ever allowed it to be on the flight line. My mother sighed, a sound of weary frustration as if she were explaining a basic concept to a difficult child. "You have to understand, Lola, Derek is part of the true elite," she said. "Your presence, the uniform, the stories about grease and mechanical repairs, your very public and very modest military salary, it all sends the wrong message. It is just too coarse, too unrefined for the image Vivian is trying to project for her future. We need everything to look perfect for Derek, and having a daughter who smells like a hanger just does not fit the brand we are building for this family." She spoke about me as if I were a smudge on a polished mirror, a piece of old, rusted equipment that needed to be tucked away in a dark corner. Coarse, unrefined. Those words echoed in my mind, tasting like ash. I looked down at my hands, the skin rough and mapped with small, permanent scars from years of working in the bellies of massive aircraft. These were the same hands that, only a month ago, had signed a check for $20,500 from my hard-earned savings to repair my father's boat. These were the hands that had wired $3,000 from my hazardous duty pay, so that Vivian could host a lavish party. My family never seemed to find my money coarse or unrefined when it was paying their bills. They reached for my bank account without a second thought, but they recoiled from the woman who actually earned it. My mother continued, her voice gaining a sharp edge of entitlement. Vivian needs a family that reflects the status she is marrying into, she insisted. Please, Lola, do not be selfish. Just stay at the base for the weekend. We can see you sometime after the holiday, perhaps next week, once the house is quiet again. The silence that followed her request felt heavy, pressing against my lungs. I felt the familiar burn of tears at the back of my eyes, the raw human urge to shout about the unfairness of it all. But my years in the Air Force had taught me something far more valuable than how to fix a turbine. They had taught me how to govern my own heart. I took a slow, deep breath, visualizing an iron box in the center of my mind. I took the rejection, the insult to my profession, and the deep, aching loneliness of being excluded from my own family. And I placed them all inside that box. I locked it tight. As a technical sergeant, I'd been trained to maintain a cold, analytical head in situations where others might panic or break. I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me hurt, and I would not beg for a seat at a table where I was not valued. Copy that, Mom, I replied, my voice now as flat and professional as if I were acknowledging a direct order from a commanding officer. I will not interfere with Vivian's operation. The line went dead before I could even say goodbye, leaving me in the silence of my cold apartment. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled. I did not head for my bed to hide under the covers, and I did not reach for a drink. Instead, I walked across the room to the heavy fireproof safe I kept bolted in the corner. They wanted to pretend I was nothing more than a lowly mechanic with a meager paycheck. They wanted to believe that the keys to their future were held by a billionaire who did not even know their names yet. Fine. But they had forgotten the most important rule of any mission. You must always know who actually holds the logistics and the assets. As the heavy door of the safe creaked open, I looked down at the documents inside, the legal papers that named me as the sole trustee of the Mitchell family estate, a portfolio worth $15,200,000 that my grandfather had hidden from his own spendthrift children. My family was waiting for a savior to walk through the front door, but they had no idea that the person they had just locked out was the only one who truly owned the house. I sat in the dim light of my apartment, the silence after my mother's phone call pressing against my ears like a heavy fog. My military training had taught me that, when a situation becomes emotionally volatile, you return to the data. You look at the facts. I pulled my laptop toward me, the screen casting a cold blue glow over my face. This machine held more than just performance reports and flight schedules. It held the architecture of my family's survival, a structure they did not even know existed. I navigated to an encrypted, hidden folder and typed in a 16-character password that I changed every 30 days out of habit. The folder was named Eleanor. Within seconds, an email from my attorney, Margaret Caldwell, appeared at the top of the inbox, with the subject line regarding the annual evaluation report for the Eleanor Mitchell Trust. As the document loaded, the final balance for the year flashed on the screen, illuminating the dark room in stark, white light. $15,240,000.00. This was the ultimate strategic secret of the Mitchell family, the invisible foundation beneath their feet. In the eyes of the law and the bank, my sister Vivian was listed as the primary beneficiary, a title that sounded grand but carried no actual weight without my signature. I was the sole trustee, vested with what the legal documents described as absolute discretion. My mother viewed me as a failure to be hidden away from her elite guests, yet in reality, I was the one who quietly reviewed and approved every single dollar that funded their performative, high society lifestyle. Seeing those long strings of zeros on the screen acted as a bridge, pulling my mind away from the cold Boston night and back to a rainy Tuesday afternoon 20 years ago. I could almost smell the metallic tang of the silver polish and the faint scent of lavender that always followed my grandmother. I remembered being 12 years old, sitting on a hard wooden stool in the kitchen while the rain drummed a relentless beat against the window. My mother had just whisked Vivian away to her expensive ballet lessons, leaving me behind with a mountain of tarnished family heirlooms. My task was to polish the massive silver tea set until it shone like a mirror. I remember my small fingers aching, the black oxidation staining my skin as I scrubbed every intricate floral carving on the teapot's spout. Grandmother Eleanor had been sitting in her high-backed armchair, her sharp, observant eyes tracking my every movement. She did not offer to help, she simply watched. Eventually, she reached out and took one of my hands in hers, her skin feeling like fine, crumpled parchment. "Your hands are becoming rough from labor, Lola," she had remarked in her gravelly, elegant voice. I'd looked down, ashamed of my messy appearance, but she had squeezed my hand firmly. She told me that those were the only hands in the house that truly understood the value of what they held. She looked toward the front door where my mother and sister had just departed and sighed. She said that they only knew how to use things until they were broken and then throw them away, but I knew how to preserve. That was the day she decided to rewrite the future of the Mitchell estate. A few weeks later, she called me into her study and placed a heavy, wrinkled hand on my shoulder, looking at me with a gravity that I did not fully understand at the time. She told me that Vivian had never gone through the basic training of life and was far too sheltered for her own good. She feared that giving Vivian the money directly would be like handing a loaded weapon to a child. It would only lead to her own destruction. She told me that she wanted me to be the one to train her. She gave me the responsibility of holding the purse strings, instructing me to only release the funds when I deemed that my sister had earned them through character and discipline. That directive had haunted and guided me for 2 decades. It was the reason I had joined the Air Force, to put myself through the most rigorous training I could find, to ensure I was worthy of the trust my grandmother had placed in me. I had spent my years living in barracks and small rentals, surviving on a modest military salary and practicing extreme discipline while my sister lived in a world of illusions funded by the very trust I managed. I had chosen the path of service and integrity, hoping that by leading by example, I could eventually help my family find their way back to reality. Coming back to the present, I closed the laptop lid with a soft, decisive click. The irony of the situation felt like a bitter pill on my tongue. My mother and sister were currently scurrying around, preparing an opulent feast to impress a billionaire, and they had cast me out because they were afraid my presence would embarrass them. They saw me as the unrefined mechanic, a smudge on their perfect social canvas. Yet, it was this very mechanic, the woman with the calloused hands and the grease under her fingernails, who was the only person standing between them and total financial ruin. I realized then that my grandmother's wish for me to train them had perhaps been hindered by my own misplaced sense of loyalty. I had been too lenient for too long, allowing them to abuse their privileges while they treated me with contempt. I picked up my phone, but I did not call my mother to argue or beg for an invitation. Instead, I opened a new message to my attorney, Margaret. My fingers moved across the screen with tactical precision. I told her that we needed to meet on Friday morning. I informed her that I intended to conduct a full audit of the discretionary spending accounts and that I needed to review the current rules of engagement for the trust. It was time to stop being the silent protector and start being the trustee that my grandmother intended me to be. The mission had changed, and the family was about to learn that when you lock out the person who holds the keys, you might find that the locks have been changed when you try to leave. If you have ever felt like the invisible pillar holding up a family that refuses to see your worth, I want you to know that you are not alone. Please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to stay with me on this journey. In the comments, I want you to type the word value. If you believe that true worth comes from your character and hard work, not just the image you present to the world. Tell me where you are listening from and if you have ever had to stand strong when your own blood treated you like an outsider. The day of Thanksgiving arrived, and the Boston sky was a heavy, suffocating blanket of gray, the exact shade of the matte paint on a C-17 Globemaster transport plane. While the rest of the nation was gathering around warm hearths and the scent of roasting poultry, I spent the morning in the stark, quiet isolation of my rented apartment. There was no aroma of cinnamon or pumpkin spice here. Instead, there was the faint, lingering smell of laundry detergent and the cold draft whistling through the window frames. To keep the encroaching shadows of loneliness at bay, I turned to the only medicine I knew, military discipline. I spent 3 hours meticulously organizing my gear, ensuring every tactical pouch was aligned and every piece of equipment was in its proper place. I took my combat boots and polished them until the black leather reflected the dim light like a dark mirror. This ritual was my meditation, a way to anchor my soul when the world tried to drift away from me. For dinner, there was no grand spread. I pulled a plastic-wrapped MRE, a meal ready to eat, from my storage bin. It was spaghetti with meat sauce, the same ration I'd eaten in the dirt of foreign lands. I activated the chemical heater, watching the steam rise with a faint hiss, and stood at my kitchen counter to eat. I swallowed the lukewarm, rubbery noodles, along with the lump of bitterness in my throat, maintaining the watchful stance of a soldier on guard duty, even though I was only guarding a hollow room. The silence was finally broken at exactly 20:47 in the evening when my phone vibrated with an incoming text. It was from Vivian. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen, before the habit of connection won out. I opened the message, and the image that appeared felt like a physical blow to my solar plexus, knocking the air from my lungs. It was a photograph of my parents' dining room, glowing with the soft, amber light of a dozen expensive candles. My father, my mother, Vivian, and Derek Hartwell were all seated around the heavy mahogany table, their faces bright with laughter and the flushed ease of expensive wine. The caption underneath was a masterclass in passive-aggressive cruelty. Vivian had written that she wanted to thank me for being so understanding about the situation and that Derek was absolutely loving the dinner. She added that he had commented on how orderly and perfect our family lineup looked. The phrase orderly family lineup rang in my ears like a mocking siren. They considered their family orderly only because they had successfully amputated the one member who didn't fit their aesthetic of wealth. I felt a sudden, sharp heat behind my eyes, but I refused to let the tears fall. Instead, I used my fingers to zoom in on the details of the photograph, my mind shifting into a cold, analytical mode. I saw my mother tilting her head back in a forced laugh, her ears adorned with the shimmering pearl earrings I had bought her with the hazard pay I earned during a grueling 6-month deployment to Qatar. I looked at my father, looking distinguished in a charcoal vest, the very one I'd picked up and paid for at the dry cleaners just last week because he had forgotten to do it himself. But the detail that cut the deepest was the centerpiece of the table. There, reflecting the candlelight, was Grandmother Eleanor's silver tea set. It was the set she had promised to me, the set I had spent 20 years polishing with my own calloused hands to preserve its history. Now, Vivian was using it as a prop, pouring tea for her billionaire boyfriend to project an image of old money refinement that she had done nothing to earn. They were feasting on the fruits of my labor, wearing the gifts of my sacrifice, and using my heritage to buy the favor of a stranger, all while I was forbidden from even standing in the doorway. The anger that had been simmering in the basement of my heart for years finally reached a boiling point, manifesting as a calm, terrifying clarity. I realized that my silence and my constant attempts to be the bigger person were not acts of sacrifice. They were acts of cowardice that had allowed this toxicity to flourish. I was facilitating my own erasure. I picked up the phone and dialed Rachel, a former teammate from the security forces who had transitioned to the civilian world a year ago. When she answered, I didn't greet her with pleasantries. I told her everything: the exclusion, the insults, the photograph, and the tea set. Rachel's voice came back through the speaker, as sharp and uncompromising as a drill sergeant's. She asked me how much longer I was going to let them treat my uniform like a costume and my dignity like a doormat. She reminded me that I was a technical sergeant in the greatest Air Force on Earth and that I had been trained to lead, not to hide in the shadows of people who didn't even know how to maintain their own lives. She told me that Grandmother Eleanor hadn't given me that trust fund so I could watch them burn it down from the sidelines. She had given me a weapon, and it was time to chamber a round. Rachel was right. My adherence to their irrational rules was a violation of the very core values I wore on my chest. Integrity first meant being honest about the fact that this relationship was broken. Service before self did not mean allowing myself to be destroyed by the ego of others. I hung up the phone and felt a strange, icy peace settle over me. I took the empty, greasy MRE bag from the counter and dropped it into the trash can with a decisive thud, a symbolic burial of the woman who took whatever scraps she was given. I walked back to my laptop and saw the glowing numbers of the trust fund again. $15 million. It was no longer just a number or a responsibility. It was the logistical weight I would use to restore balance. I sent a final text to the family group chat. I didn't argue, and I didn't complain. I simply wrote that I hoped they enjoyed the tea, because the menu for the rest of the year was about to change drastically. The campaign for my own respect had officially begun, and I was no longer interested in a peaceful resolution. On Friday morning, I stepped onto State Street in the heart of Boston, leaving the biting wind behind as I entered the polished lobby of the firm belonging to Margaret Caldwell. I was not wearing my Air Force uniform today. Instead, I had chosen a simple, charcoal-colored professional suit. Neat, sharp, and disciplined. It was the civilian equivalent of my service dress, a different kind of armor for a different kind of mission. Margaret Caldwell was 65 years old, with a mane of powerful silver hair cut into a sharp bob that commanded immediate respect. She was one of the top estate attorneys in the city, a woman who didn't suffer fools and who valued precision above all else. When I entered her office, she stood up immediately, offering a firm, dry handshake that felt like an acknowledgement between equals. There was no pity in her eyes, none of the patronizing, "Thank you for your service" platitudes I often received from civilians. She looked at me and saw a woman who held the keys to a kingdom. She gestured for me to sit and placed a thick, leather-bound folder on the mahogany desk between us. "It is good to see you, Sergeant Mitchell," she said, her voice rich with professional esteem. "We need to review the financial rules of engagement before the Monday deadline. The Eleanor Mitchell Trust has been performing exceptionally well under your oversight, growing at a rate that would make most hedge fund managers envious. But we have a complication." Margaret slid a document across the desk. "Your sister, Vivian, has submitted a formal request for an early withdrawal of $500,000. She's claiming it is for a strategic investment in her boyfriend's firm, Hartwell Capital." I looked at the request, a cold smile touching my lips. "An investment?" I asked, my voice steady. "Or is it a down payment on a billionaire's affection?" I turned to Section 4.2 of the trust documents, the words I had memorized years ago. It stated clearly that the trustee, myself, held absolute discretion over the distribution of assets. The beneficiary had no legal standing to demand funds unless they could prove a level of financial literacy and personal responsibility that Vivian had never even attempted to achieve. Margaret nodded in agreement, leaning back in her chair. "Exactly. You are the one in command here, Lola. Your grandmother was a visionary. She knew Vivian would eventually try to use the family legacy to buy her way into a social circle she didn't earn. She entrusted you with the power to say no. Do you intend to approve this?" "No," I replied, closing the folder with a decisive click that echoed in the quiet room. "Not now, and certainly not for this reason. Vivian needs to understand the weight of $1 before she's allowed to spend 500,000 of them. My grandmother wanted me to train her, and a soldier doesn't learn anything if you give them the medal before they have even finished basic training." Margaret's eyes twinkled with a rare spark of genuine approval. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a heavy cream-colored envelope. "Good. Now, beyond the trust. I have something else for you. Do you remember the separate inheritance of $50,000 that your grandmother left specifically for your personal use?" I nodded. I remembered it well, but I hadn't spent a single cent of it on myself. I told Margaret that I had directed the entire amount to be donated anonymously to the Beacon Hill Veteran and Family Support Fund over the last 2 years. It was the right thing to do. My military salary was enough for my needs, and there were families in our community who had sacrificed far more than I had. Integrity is doing the right thing when no one is watching, and I didn't need a plaque on a wall to justify my grandmother's gift. Margaret leaned forward, her expression softening into something resembling pride. "Well, Lola, they found out. The board of the fund realized who their anonymous donor was, and they want to honor you. Tomorrow evening, at the Harrington Plaza Hotel, there is a grand winter gala. It is the most prestigious event of the season. Your mother and Vivian are already planning to attend with Derek Hartwell, hoping to rub shoulders with the elite. But they are only general admission guests, people who bought their way in to be seen. You, however, are a different story." She pulled a heavy, solid gold card from the envelope and slid it toward me. It was engraved with my name, Lola Mitchell, founding sponsor. The weight of the card in my hand felt substantial, a physical manifestation of the silent work I had done while my family had looked down on me. "You are a VIP guest of honor, Lola," Margaret said. "Your rank in that room will be higher than anyone else in your family, including the billionaire boyfriend. You have been the hidden pillar of this community and this family for long enough. It is time for you to step into the light." I looked at the gold card, remembering my mother's voice telling me that I was too coarse and that my presence would be a message of failure. A quiet, tactical calm settled over me. This wasn't about vanity or revenge, it was about the restoration of balance. My family had spent years treating me like a servant while they lived off the grace I provided. They thought they were the ones ascending to the elite, unaware that I was already there, holding the door open for them. "Thank you, Margaret," I said, standing up and tucking the card into my pocket. "I will be there. And I think I know exactly what kind of uniform is required for this specific battle." I walked out of the office and onto the streets of Boston, no longer just a daughter who had been excluded, but a woman who was finally ready to take her place at the head of the table. It was late Friday afternoon, and the low sun was casting long, jagged shadows across the floor of my 40-meter square apartment. I was in the middle of a pre-shift ritual, meticulously inspecting my service dress uniform for the slightest speck of lint, preparing for the night watch at the base. The rhythmic quiet was suddenly obliterated by a frantic, heavy pounding on my front door that didn't sound like a request, but a breach. When I pulled the door open, I found myself facing a tactical formation I hadn't expected. My mother Patricia, my father Harold, and my sister Vivian. Their faces were a chaotic map of desperation and suppressed rage. Without waiting for an invitation or even a greeting, they pushed past me into my living space, their expensive perfumes clashing violently with the faint, honest scent of hydraulic fluid that seemed to cling to the walls of my home. My mother immediately wrinkled her nose in a display of profound disgust, pulling a designer tissue from her handbag to wipe down the cushion of my sofa before she would even consider sitting. She looked around my modest quarters as if she were standing in the middle of a hazardous waste site, her eyes scanning the simple military furniture and the lack of luxury with a cold, judgmental sneer. My sister Vivian followed suit, rolling her eyes and kicking my running shoes out of her path with a sharp, pointed heel as she paced the small room like a caged animal. My father stayed near the door, refusing to make eye contact, looking like a man who was merely following orders he didn't quite understand. I stood my ground in the center of the room, my hands clasped behind my back in a parade rest position, my voice coming out as flat and cold as a winter morning on the flight line. I asked them exactly why they were violating my privacy on a Friday afternoon. Vivian didn't waste time with pleasantries. She slammed a thick manila folder onto my kitchen table with enough force to make my coffee mug rattle. She told me that Derek had run a comprehensive background check on the entire family as part of his firm's due diligence, and he had found something he couldn't explain. Her voice was trembling with a mix of greed and accusation as she shouted about the Eleanor Mitchell Trust. She screamed the number aloud, $15,240,000. She demanded to know why I had been hiding the existence of that money from them, her eyes bulging with the realization of the wealth I controlled. My mother joined in, her voice shifting into a terrifyingly sweet, manipulative register that I knew all too well. She said there must have been a grave mistake, suggesting that our grandmother had clearly lost her mental faculties toward the end. She argued that no rational person would ever leave such a massive fortune under the control of someone with my supposedly limited financial perspective. She called me just a simple soldier and asked what I could possibly know about managing a multi-million-dollar portfolio. She slid a legal document across the table, a power of attorney form, and told me to sign it immediately to transfer control to her so she could properly provide for Vivian's future. I looked down at the paper and then back at the three people who had spent my entire life telling me I wasn't good enough to sit at their table. A small, sharp laugh escaped my lips, one that held no humor. I asked my mother if she really believed I lacked financial perspective. I reminded her that every single day, I was responsible for the maintenance budgets of aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars, ensuring that every cent was accounted for and every mission was funded. I looked at Vivian and asked her what she had ever managed besides her own vanity and a revolving door of credit card debt. Vivian's face turned a deep, ugly shade of crimson as she shrieked that my manual labor was a joke compared to the high society life she was destined for. She accused me of being a jealous, petty sister who was holding the money hostage as a pathetic form of revenge because I hadn't been invited to Thanksgiving. She called me an embarrassment to the family name, telling me that I lived like a peasant in a slum and that I didn't deserve to breathe the same air as the money our grandmother had earned. The air in the room felt thick with their entitlement and their blatant disregard for my existence as anything other than a source of revenue. I felt the old urge to defend myself rising in my chest, but I suppressed it, choosing instead to hold the line with the cold discipline I had practiced for 12 years. I told them firmly that I wasn't obstructing anything. I was simply executing the direct orders and the mission my grandmother had entrusted to me. I informed them that it was my duty to ensure these resources were used for their intended purpose, and I made it very clear that Grandmother Eleanor's intent was never to fund Vivian's collection of designer handbags or Derek's investment schemes. My mother stood up abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor, her face contorted in a mask of pure fury. She warned me that if I didn't cooperate, they would make my life a living hell. She told me that I was forbidden from showing my face at the winter gala the following night, threatening that the security team would have orders to throw me out into the street if I dared to try and ruin Vivian's big moment. I reached into my pocket and slowly pulled out the heavy, solid gold card Margaret had given me. I held it up so the light from the window hit the engraving, making the words flash in the dim room. I told them that, as it happened, I had already received my invitation. I pointed to the title etched beneath my name, Founding Sponsor. I informed them that my rank at that event was significantly higher than they realized, and that if anyone was going to be escorted out, it certainly wouldn't be me. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother's mouth hung open, and Vivian froze mid-sentence, her eyes locked on the gold card as if it were a ghost. They looked at the card, then at my small apartment, and then back at me. The realization finally sinking in that the daughter they had spent a decade dismissing was the one holding all the power. I stepped toward the door and opened it wide, gesturing for them to leave. I told them that our meeting was adjourned and that I had a shift to catch. As they stumbled out into the hallway, still in a state of shock, I felt a strange sense of peace. The battle lines had been drawn, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just defending a position. I was preparing to take the field. The heavy oak doors slammed shut with a finality that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of my small apartment, leaving a deafening, ringing silence in its wake. I stood frozen in the center of the room, my chest heaving, the air still thick with the toxic residue of my family's greed and entitlement. For a long moment, I didn't move, my eyes fixed on the empty space where they had stood just seconds ago, hurling insults at my life and my service. Then, my gaze drifted downward, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. On the floor, near the entryway, lay the wreckage of my most prized possessions. In her frantic, angry exit, Vivian had accidentally swept her arm across the small display shelf I kept near the door. My meritorious service medals lay scattered like discarded coins, but that wasn't what stopped my heart. It was the triangular glass display case. It had shattered into 1,000 jagged diamonds, and resting in the middle of the glass shards was the American flag that had draped my grandfather's casket. A man who had served 30 years in the Air Force with honor that my sister couldn't even fathom. But the sight that turned my blood to ice was the muddy, deep indentation of a designer heel directly on the blue field of white stars. Vivian hadn't just knocked it down. She had stepped squarely on it as she stormed out, treating a symbol of ultimate sacrifice like a common doormat. A strange, hollow numbness washed over me as I sank to my knees, the glass crunching beneath my palms, though I felt no pain. My hands, usually so steady when calibrating a multi-million-dollar jet engine, were trembling violently as I reached for the soiled fabric. I picked up the flag, cradling it against my chest, my thumb brushing over the dark, wet smear of Boston slush and filth that now defiled the stars. To Patricia and Vivian, this was just an old piece of cloth, a dusty rag decorating a shabby apartment. They didn't see the decades of missed birthdays, the bitter cold of flight lines, or the quiet dignity of a soldier's burial. They only saw something that didn't have a luxury price tag attached to it. The first tear fell then, hot and stinging, landing right next to the mud stain. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but the first drop of a volcanic rage that had been dormant for 15 years. I realized in that moment that my stoicism hadn't been a virtue. It had been a permission slip for them to treat me like a ghost in my own life. I had allowed them to insult my uniform, my salary, and my home. But I would not allow them to desecrate the memory of the man who taught me what honor actually meant. I gripped the flag tighter, the sharp edges of the broken glass cutting into my skin, and I made a silent vow to the man who wasn't there to hear it. I whispered to the empty room that I had been far too weak, that I had let them shackle me with the guilt of being a good daughter, while they picked my pockets and spat on my profession. That version of Lola Mitchell died on the floor of this apartment, right alongside that broken glass. I stood up, my movements now fluid and dangerously calm, the kind of calm that precedes a Category 5 hurricane. I placed the flag on my kitchen table, carefully brushing away the larger shards of glass. I didn't call my mother to scream, and I didn't text Vivian to demand an apology she was incapable of giving. Instead, I walked into my bedroom and pulled my laptop from its bag. I sat on the edge of my bed and dialed a number that Rachel, my old security forces teammate, had given me months ago. It was the private line for a high-end stylist who specialized in image restoration for the city's power players. When a man answered, his voice smooth and professional, I didn't hesitate. I told him my name and that I was the founding sponsor for the winter gala at the Harrington Plaza. I told him I needed a gown for tomorrow night, something in midnight black, something that didn't just look expensive, but looked like authority. I told him I wanted to look like a queen who was preparing to sign a death warrant for a traitorous court. I could almost hear his intake of breath on the other end of the line, the professional recognizing the tone of a woman who had finally found her war footing. We spent the next 30 minutes coordinating the logistics, a private fitting at 5 o'clock in the morning, a professional makeup artist who knew how to emphasize the cold steel in a person's eyes, and a car service that would arrive exactly 10 minutes after the main guests had been seated. As I hung up the phone, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me didn't look like the coarse mechanic my mother described. She looked like a technical sergeant who had just received her rules of engagement and was ready to neutralize the target. Tomorrow at the Harrington, I wasn't going to show up to make them proud or seek their approval. I was going to show up to reclaim the keys to the house they thought they owned. Vivian wanted a performance. She was about to get a masterclass in the price of disrespect. I walked back to the kitchen, picked up the muddy flag, and began the slow, meticulous process of cleaning it, one star at a time. The battle hadn't even started yet, but I already knew who was going to be left standing. If you have ever had your sacrifices thrown back in your face by the people you were trying to protect, then you know exactly why I am doing this. Please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the moment the truth finally comes out. In the comments, I want you to type the word honor if you believe that some things are too sacred to be stepped on, no matter how much money is involved. I want to hear your stories of the moment you finally decided to stop playing by the rules of people who have no respect for you. Where are you listening from tonight, and are you ready for the gala? Saturday evening arrived with a chilling frost that seemed to sharpen the world, and I stood before the full-length mirror in my bedroom, preparing for a different kind of deployment. I was no longer looking at the woman who had been ordered to stay away from Thanksgiving, or the daughter who was considered too coarse for her own family. I was looking at a technical sergeant who had transitioned into a tactical operator of the highest social order. The dress I had chosen was a midnight black silk that draped over my body like liquid shadow, hugging the frame I'd built through years of grueling military conditioning and early morning drills. It was simple, devoid of the flashy sequins or desperate ruffles that Vivian favored. Yet the quality of the fabric whispered a language of absolute power and quiet authority. I had pulled my hair into a sleek high bun, that exposed the elegant line of my neck and highlighted the cold, unwavering focus in my eyes. My makeup was minimal, but sharp, designed to accentuate the features of a woman who was used to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. I wore no expensive diamonds or inherited gold. Instead, the only ornament on my chest was the heavy, solid gold badge I'd received from Margaret, pinned exactly over my heart. The engraving caught the light, gleaming with the words, Lola Mitchell, founding sponsor. It was my medal of honor for this specific battlefield, a symbol that I was no longer a guest in their world, but one of its architects. I chose not to arrive in a flashy limousine that would draw the wrong kind of attention before I was ready. Instead, I called a professional Uber Black service, a sleek, anonymous vehicle that reflected my need for a stealthy approach. As the car pulled up to the grand entrance of the Harrington Plaza Hotel, the air was thick with the scent of high-end perfume and the rhythmic popping of paparazzi flashes. I took a single, deep breath, visualizing the oxygen filling my lungs and steadying my pulse as I stepped out onto the red carpet. I didn't walk with the tentative seeking steps of a socialite hoping to be noticed. I walked with the measured, commanding stride of a senior non-commissioned officer conducting a final inspection. My back was a straight line of steel, my head held high with a level of confidence that seemed to carve a path through the crowd. Around me, I heard the faint murmurs of the gathered onlookers and journalists, their voices hushed as they tried to place my face. I heard someone ask if I was a new international star, or perhaps a high-level diplomat. But I kept my gaze fixed forward. This wasn't a fashion show. It was a helicopter landing pad, and I was coming in for a heavy touchdown. The interior of the ballroom was a dazzling spectacle of crystal chandeliers that cast a shimmering light over a sea of expensive tuxedos and designer gowns. A soft jazz ensemble played in the background, their music providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the calculated networking happening in every corner. I glided through the room with a glass of champagne in my hand, my eyes scanning the perimeter like a radar sweep. It didn't take long to find my targets. From a strategic distance, I observed my family. My mother, Patricia, was leaning in close to a group of wealthy-looking women, her laughter sounding forced and brittle as she performed the role of a social elite. Vivian was standing beside her, clinging to Derek Hartwell's arm with a grip that looked desperate. She was constantly tugging at the hem of her overly ornate dress and checking her reflection in the gilded mirrors, her face a mask of anxious insecurity. They looked remarkably small in this vast room, like children playing dress-up in a world that didn't belong to them. A brief, fleeting moment of pity touched my heart, but I quickly suppressed it, remembering the muddy heel print on my grandfather's flag. The time for mercy had passed. I checked the clock on the wall. It was exactly 1948. I moved into my final position, ready for the direct engagement. Derek Hartwell was the first one to sense the change in the atmosphere. He was clearly growing bored with Vivian's shallow chatter and my mother's repetitive stories when his gaze drifted across the room and collided with mine. I saw the moment his eyes locked onto me, his brow furrowing as he tried to reconcile the elegant, commanding woman in front of him with the coarse mechanic he had been told about. He went still, his professional instincts kicking in as his eyes traveled down to the gold badge pinned to my dress. I saw him lean in and whisper to Vivian, his voice urgent as he asked her if the woman across the room was her sister. Vivian turned around, her expression shifting from irritation to a pale, ghostly shock that drained every drop of color from her face. She looked at my dress, she looked at my hair, and then her eyes landed on the gold card that designated me as a founding sponsor. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I didn't say a word. I simply raised my glass in a slow, deliberate toast, my eyes holding hers with a terrifying, icy calm. It was a silent declaration of war, a signal that the storm they had invited into their lives had finally arrived, and I was the one standing in the center of the gale. I stood near the edge of the lavish buffet table, my fingers wrapped firmly around the stem of a crystal glass filled with sparkling wine. My breathing was slow and rhythmic, the practiced breath of a soldier waiting for a target to enter the kill zone. Across the shimmering expanse of the ballroom, I watched as the trio made their approach. Derek Hartwell led the way, looking every bit the high-powered executive in his tailored tuxedo, while Vivian clung to his arm like a drowning person clutching a life raft. My mother, Patricia, followed closely behind, her chin tilted at an angle that suggested a level of social triumph she had done nothing to earn. As they drew closer, the artificial light from the massive chandeliers glinted off the gold badge on my chest, and I felt a surge of cold, tactical satisfaction. I did not step back into the shadows. I stood my ground, raising my glass in a slight, mocking toast as our eyes finally met. Derek came to an abrupt halt, his expression shifting from casual boredom to a sharp, stinging confusion. He looked at my face, then at the photograph Vivian had shown him of her sister supposedly working on a flight line in Qatar, and then back to the woman standing before him in a gown of midnight silk. "Lola?" he asked, his voice carrying a heavy weight of suspicion that made Vivian flinch. He demanded to know if this was truly her sister, the one she had described as being thousands of miles away on a deployment. Vivian's reaction was instantaneous and pathetic. I watched the panic flood her eyes, turning them wide and glassy as her carefully constructed world began to crumble in real time. She tried to pivot, her voice rising into a frantic, high-pitched whisper as she attempted to spin one last, desperate lie. She told Derek that I must have just arrived back in the country, and that I was not mentally stable enough to be at such an event. She claimed I was just a lowly mechanic who had likely snuck in through the service entrance to cause a scene. My mother joined the offensive, leaning in toward Derek with a look of feigned maternal heartbreak. She whispered that I had developed severe psychological issues following my time in the war, and that the family was deeply ashamed of my presence there. They spoke about me as if I were a ghost, a broken thing that didn't deserve to stand on the same marble floor as them. I remained silent, allowing their words to hang in the air like smoke. I let them dig their own graves, watching as they piled lie upon lie, unaware that the audience they were performing for had already shifted. The silence of a senior non-commissioned officer is a powerful tool. And at that moment, it was more devastating than any shout could have been. The atmosphere in the room changed the moment Margaret Caldwell stepped out of the crowd. She moved with the irresistible force of a battleship, her silver hair gleaming under the lights as she approached our group. She didn't acknowledge Vivian's existence, nor did she grant my mother a single glance. Instead, she stopped directly in front of me and performed a slow, respectful nod that drew the eyes of every power player in the immediate vicinity. She spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the quieted circle of guests. She informed me that the Gala committee was ready for me to join them on the main stage to be officially recognized as the founding sponsor for the entire winter event. The color completely drained from my mother's face, leaving her looking haggard and old. Margaret then turned her gaze toward Derek Hartwell, her eyes narrowing with a clinical precision. She introduced herself as the lead attorney for the Eleanor Mitchell Trust and asked Derek if he was fully aware of who he was speaking to. She stated quite clearly for everyone to hear that Sergeant Lola Mitchell was the sole trustee of the $15,200,000 estate, holding absolute discretion over every cent that the rest of the family currently used to fund their lifestyle. The sound of Vivian's champagne glass shattering against the floor was the only thing that broke the absolute silence of the ballroom. The shards of crystal scattered across the marble, reflecting the light like tiny, broken promises. I watched Derek's face transform as the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. His confusion vanished, replaced by a cold, searing disgust that directed itself entirely toward the woman still clutching his arm. He repeated the figure, $15 million, and looked at Vivian with an expression that suggested he was seeing her for the very first time. He asked her if she had actually intended to maintain the lie that she was the heiress and that I was the parasitic burden. Derek let out a short, hollow laugh that was devoid of any humor. He told her that while he had dealt with gold diggers in his line of work, he found nothing more repulsive than a liar who would betray and belittle their own blood for the sake of a social climb. He reached down and firmly uncoupled Vivian's hand from his sleeve, brushing off his jacket as if he were removing a layer of filth. He turned to me, offering a sincere apology for the misunderstanding and stating that he clearly needed to reevaluate the company he kept. He walked away without a backward glance, leaving Vivian and my mother standing in the center of the room, completely isolated and stripped of their borrowed dignity under the unforgiving glare of the crystal chandeliers. I stood there for a moment longer, savoring the silence before turning to follow Margaret toward the stage. The house of cards had finally collapsed, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the deck. The grand ballroom of the Harrington Plaza was slowly emptying, the shimmering excitement of the evening replaced by a cold, heavy silence that draped over the room like a shroud. I stood near the marble pillars, the weight of the midnight black silk gown feeling like ceremonial armor as I watched the last of the elite guests trickle out into the frosty Boston night. The high of the confrontation had passed, leaving in its wake a clinical, tactical clarity. My family remained in the center of the lobby, a fractured unit standing amidst the wreckage of their social ambitions. My mother, Patricia, did not wait for the staff to clear the area before she lunged toward me, her face a distorted mask of fury that no amount of expensive foundation could hide. She hissed that I must be satisfied with myself, accusing me of cold-bloodedly murdering my sister's future. She screamed that Derek had vanished without a word and that I was a cruel, heartless monster for what I had done. Vivian stood behind her, a pathetic figure of smeared mascara and ruined silk, sobbing with a theatrical intensity that no longer moved me. I simply stood there with my arms folded, watching them with the same detached observation I used when inspecting a faulty turbine. I told her calmly that I had not killed anything. I had simply allowed the truth to do its work. I informed her that the role of the poor, struggling soldier she had tried to force me into was officially over, and I would not be accepting any further scripts from her. The conversation then shifted to the only thing that truly mattered to them, the logistics of the money. I saw the sharp flicker of greed in my mother's eyes, even through her tears. I told them both that at 8 o'clock on Monday morning, I would be sitting in Margaret Caldwell's office to sign a formal order. I explained that under the authority of Clause 4.2, I was implementing a total freeze on all discretionary distributions from the Eleanor Mitchell Trust for the next 12 months. The announcement hit them with the force of a physical blow. Vivian let out a strangled cry of disbelief, her voice cracking as she shouted that I could not do this to them. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register that silenced her immediately. I told her that I could, and I would. I explained that they had spent years treating our grandmother's legacy like a personal ATM, while treating the person who guarded it like a servant. That era of entitlement was finished. I was no longer the silent protector, I was now the commanding officer of their financial survival. I laid out the terms of their new reality with the precision of a military briefing. I told Vivian that if she wanted to see a single cent of that $15 million after the 12-month freeze, she would have to prove she possessed a shred of the character our grandmother valued. I informed her that she was required to find a legitimate job, not a socialite internship, but a real position with a paycheck, and maintain it for a full year. Furthermore, she was required to enroll in and complete a certified course in personal financial management. I told her that there would be no more designer handbags, no more five-star dinners, and no more luxury vacations funded by the sweat of my brow and the blood of our grandfather. If she could prove after 1 year that she understood the value of $1 and could live within her means, we would discuss a modest, controlled allowance. Until then, she was on her own. My mother began to wail about the unfairness of it all, but I cut her off with a sharp gesture of my hand. I told her that giving money to someone who did not respect the effort required to earn it was not love. It was a form of slow destruction, and I would no longer be a participant in their ruin. Throughout this entire exchange, my father, Harold, had remained a silent shadow in the background. He had spent 30 years avoiding conflict, allowing my mother to dictate the terms of our family life while he looked the other way. But as my mother turned to him, demanding that he do something to stop me, he finally stepped forward. He did not yell, and he did not reach for his wallet. Instead, he placed a firm hand on my mother's shoulder and told her to be quiet. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw a profound, aching sense of realization in his eyes. He told her that I was right. He admitted that they had failed me as parents, that they had taken my sacrifices for granted while chasing shadows of wealth that didn't belong to them. He said that grandmother Eleanor had seen the truth in all of us long before we did, and she had chosen the only person with the strength to save this family from itself. He looked at me with a mixture of pride and deep regret. acknowledging that I had become a woman of honor despite the lack of support I had received at home. I looked at my father, and for a fleeting second, I felt the old urge to reach out, to find some common ground in his sudden awakening. But the image of the muddy heel print on the burial flag flashed in my mind, and the warmth vanished. I told him that I appreciated his words, but they were 20 years too late to change the rules of engagement. I informed him that I needed time and space away from all of them. I requested that none of them attempt to contact me at the base or come to my apartment until they were prepared to speak to me with the respect I had earned. I turned my back on them, the midnight black silk of my gown sweeping across the marble as I walked toward the exit. The night air of Boston was biting and sharp, but as I stepped onto the sidewalk, it felt cleaner than the air inside the ballroom. I pulled out my phone and with a few steady swipes, blocked my mother's and Vivian's numbers. I felt a strange, icy sense of peace settle over my heart. I had not just achieved a victory, I had established a new order. The martial law of the Mitchell family had officially begun, and I was finally the one in control of the peace. 1 month had passed since the night at the Harrington Plaza, and the first true blizzard of the season had descended upon Boston, wrapping the city in a thick, silent blanket of white. Inside my small apartment, the air was no longer thin and cold, and the silence was no longer heavy with isolation. Instead, the space was filled with the rich, savory aroma of fresh pepperoni pizza and the crisp scent of local craft beer. My living room, once a stark transition point between the base and my lonely thoughts, was now vibrating with the sound of laughter and the low, comforting rumble of voices I trusted. My apartment did not have a mahogany table or silver candelabras, but as I looked around at the people sitting on my floor and my modest sofa, I realized I was looking at something far more valuable. Rachel was there, leaning against the kitchen counter and telling a story about a botched training exercise that had us all in stitches. A few of my fellow mechanics from Hanscom were there, along with 2 veterans I had met through the support fund, men who had forgotten what a warm Christmas felt like until this year. This was my chosen family, a group of people held together not by blood or obligation, but by shared history, mutual respect, and a deep understanding of what it meant to serve. A sharp, rhythmic knock at the door cut through the noise. I stood up, feeling a brief, instinctive tension in my shoulders, but I forced myself to relax. When I opened the door, I found my father, Harold, standing in the hallway. He was shivering slightly, brushing a layer of fresh snow from the shoulders of his overcoat and holding a small, clumsily wrapped gift. He looked at me with a tentative, hopeful expression that I had not seen in years. He asked if he could come in for a moment, explaining that things at the house had become unbearable, with Patricia's constant complaining and Vivian's sulking. I felt a pang of sympathy for him, but it was tempered by the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. I offered him a small, genuine smile and stepped aside, telling him to come in because the beer was still cold. As he entered, he seemed overwhelmed by the energy in the room. He was greeted by my friends, and for the first time, he sat amongst them, listening as Rachel and the others spoke of my work and my character with genuine admiration. I watched him realize that the daughter he had spent decades overlooking was considered a leader and a hero by the people who actually knew her. In the middle of the evening, my phone vibrated on the counter. I picked it up, expecting a message from the base, but I saw Vivian's name on the screen. There were no insults this time, no demands for money, and no theatrical displays of victimhood. It was a simple screenshot, a confirmation page for an online personal finance and accounting course at a local community college. Beneath the image, she had typed a short, terse message. She said she had started the classes and told me not to expect a thank you, but she wished me a Merry Christmas nonetheless. I felt a dry, quiet laugh escape my lips. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. There were no false promises of change or desperate pleas for forgiveness, just a cold acknowledgement of the reality I'd forced upon her. I typed back a short reply, telling her to keep moving forward and that I was still watching. It was not a reconciliation, but it was a beginning, a foundation of accountability that our family had never possessed before. As the night grew late and my friends began to filter out into the snow, the apartment returned to a peaceful quiet. My father was the last to leave, giving me a brief, firm hug that felt like a quiet apology for all the years of silence. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the snowflakes dance in the yellow glow of the streetlights and looking toward the distant, dark silhouette of Beacon Hill. I did not feel like the black sheep anymore, and I did not feel like a woman waiting for an invitation that was never going to come. I walked over to the shelf where I'd once kept the old family photograph, the one where I was standing on the far edge, looking like an afterthought. I picked it up, looked at the artificial smiles of the people who did not know me, and gently turned it face down in the drawer. In its place, I set a new photo that Rachel had snapped earlier that evening. It was a picture of me, my father, Rachel, and my teammates, all of us laughing together with our glasses raised. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool, clean air fill my lungs, and for a moment, I stood at attention. I raised my hand to my brow in a crisp, solemn salute to the empty air, to Grandmother Eleanor, to the grandfather whose flag was now clean and safe, and to the girl who had finally stopped waiting to be loved and started loving herself. The mission was complete. I was no longer just a daughter or a soldier. I was finally free. The story of Lola Mitchell serves as a powerful reminder that your worth is never defined by those who fail to see it. True strength is not found in the superficial luxury of a ballroom, but in the quiet discipline of a flight line and the integrity to do the right thing when no one is watching. By choosing to hold the line and establish firm boundaries, Lola taught us that protecting your peace is a necessity rather than a luxury. When you stop seeking approval from toxic sources, you finally clear the path for a life built on genuine honor and self-love. Your value is forged through your character and the resilience you show in the face of adversity. Now we want to hear from you, because your journey matters just as much as Lola's. Have you ever been the black sheep of your family only to find your true tribe elsewhere? We invite you to share your story of resilience or tell us about the person who became your chosen family when you needed it most. If this story resonated with you, please support the channel by hitting the like button and subscribing for more journeys of strength and justice. Leave a comment below with the word freedom if you are ready to reclaim your own narrative, and let us know which state you are listening from tonight.